Galen Young, a 45-year-old professional basketball player and coach, died in one of the freakiest accidents imaginable in 2021. Around 2:30 a.m., a 19-year-old driver crashed into the Memphis home where Young was staying, causing part of the house to collapse and bury him beneath the rubble. His family didn't even realize he was inside, so rescuers initially weren't looking for him. His body was discovered more than 4 hours later when relatives were clearing debris. Young had been preparing to start a new high school basketball coaching job in Jackson, Mississippi the very next day. The driver was later charged and ultimately pleaded guilty to reckless vehicular homicide. On April 29, 1945, American troops entered Dachau concentration camp and were met with thousands of starving prisoners in a train packed with decomposing bodies. Without orders, many enraged U.S. soldiers began rounding up and executing captured SS guards, while newly freed prisoners also attacked and killed some of their former captors. Roughly 50 German personnel are believed to have been killed in the reprisals. The executions were never officially sanctioned, but after witnessing the horrors of Dachau firsthand, some of its liberators couldn't help themselves. That was the moment 21-year-old Australian daredevil Valley Graham launched himself from the top of the 140-foot Minnehaha Falls in the Blue Mountains while attempting an unofficial freestyle death diving record. Graham spun 3 times during the fall, but hit the water with so much force in a pike position that he was knocked unconscious, fracturing his spine, sternum, and skull and rupturing an eardrum. Incredibly, Graham regained consciousness in the water, managed to pull himself out, and then walked nearly a mile up a steep trail before his friends could drive him to a hospital. He later underwent 2 surgeries, with rods and plates installed to stabilize his back and chest, and was miraculously back on his feet just a few days later. Graham survived and later called the ordeal a gift from God, saying it forced him to slow down and rethink his life. This is why you should always get a tetanus shot after a deep cut from something like rusted metal or glass. The photo shows an unvaccinated child suffering from severe tetanus, displaying one of the most disturbing symptoms of the disease. Tetanus releases an extremely powerful neurotoxin called tetanospasmin, which blocks the signals that normally tell muscles to relax. Once the toxin binds to the nerve endings, antitoxin can't undo the damage that's already been done. Severe cases can cause lockjaw before progressing into agonizing full-body spasms that are so powerful the spine violently arches backward into this position, known as opisthotonus. Patients often remain conscious during these attacks, which may be triggered as something as minor as light, noise, or touch. The contractions can become so violent that they fracture bones, while spasms of the throat and breathing muscles can prevent breathing entirely, causing suffocation and death. Despite how horrific tetanus can become, it's largely preventable through vaccination. This Nolan brother wrote the blockbuster movie Interstellar and went on to create acclaimed shows like Westworld and Fallout. This Nolan brother directed Interstellar along with award-winning films like Inception, The Dark Knight, and The Odyssey, becoming one of the most celebrated filmmakers of all time. This Nolan brother was accused of kidnapping and murdering an American businessman in Costa Rica and later tried to escape federal custody. Christopher and Jonathan Nolan's older brother Matthew Nolan was arrested by the FBI in 2009 over the death of businessman Robert Cohen, whose beaten and tortured body was found beneath a bridge. Prosecutors alleged the killing stemmed from a multi-million-dollar dispute, but a U.S. judge ruled the evidence too speculative to extradite Nolan, and he was never convicted of the murder. While he was jailed in Chicago, authorities uncovered an elaborate escape plot involving a hidden razor blade and a 31-foot rope made from knotted bed sheets, allegedly intending to help him escape through his cell window. Nolan later pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice, receiving 14 months in federal prison. This is some of the final footage of Harry R. Truman after he refused to evacuate Mount St. Helens. Truman was an 83-year-old lodge owner who insisted, "They'll never get me off this mountain," despite weeks of earthquakes and warnings that the volcano was on the verge of erupting. His wife had died years earlier and was buried on the property, and Truman said he wanted to be buried beside her. He also refused to leave behind his 16 beloved cats, believing that if he stayed to care for them, they would survive alongside him. As reporters flocked to interview him, he became a national symbol of defiance, declaring that the mountain had been his home for decades and that he would rather die there than abandon it. On May 18, 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted, triggering the largest landslide ever recorded in a devastating lateral blast that buried his lodge beneath hundreds of feet of rock, ash, and debris. Neither Truman nor his cats were ever found or recovered, as they're believed to remain eternally entombed beneath the mountain. Jerry, better known online as Gazelle Beauty, was born with megalocornea, an extremely rare genetic disorder that causes the corneas to grow far larger than usual. The condition gave Jerry unusually large eyes from birth, leading many childhood photos to go viral because of their unsettling appearance. While often mistaken for a cosmetic trait, megalocornea is a lifelong medical condition that can be associated with vision problems, light sensitivity, and an increased risk of serious eye complications later on in life. The disorder is so rare that very few doctors will ever encounter a patient with it during their entire careers. In 2024, 26-year-old American YouTuber Elliot Eastman repeatedly told his audience he feared armed men would come for him while living in a conflict-prone region of the Philippines. After marrying a local woman and openly documenting his life, income, and whereabouts online, Eastman randomly ended one of his live streams without saying goodbye. Roughly 2 hours later, armed men reportedly arrived at his home, shot him, and abducted him by boat. Despite extensive searches, his body was never recovered, leaving his ultimate fate officially unsolved but widely presumed fatal. Made sometime before 1834, this sealskin whaling suit from Greenland is the only complete suit of its kind in the world. The hunter climbed in through the center hole and made the suit waterproof by pulling the hole closed. In 1972, a man snorkeling along the coast of Italy called the police when he noticed a human hand sticking out of the sand. It ended up being two ancient Greek bronze statues that were sculpted around 500 BC. This ancient Roman temple theater complex was discovered in Italy by total chance in the year 2000. Located on the tip of a mountain, the complex dates back to the 4th century BCE. This 4,000-year-old golden ram and stone lion were found inside of a tomb at Göner Tepe in Turkmenistan. The finger in the background shows how small these figures truly are, a testament to the incredible skills of the craftsmen from this time. Here's a 1997 photo of Las Vegas police facing Mike Tyson after he'd just bitten off the ear of Evander Holyfield during a boxing match. Tyson claimed he was in a primal, blacked-out state and literally wanted to kill his opponent. In 2013, a Brazilian woman confessed to lacing her cooter with poison so that her husband would die after going down on her. This fox drowned in a frozen lake and was cut out and displayed as a warning for people to keep off the ice. Just last week, an 88-year-old Frenchman caused an entire hospital to be evacuated for the strangest of reasons. He had a shell from World War I stuck inside of his anus, which the hospital considered to be a bomb threat, and a defusing team was called in. They determined the shell was not at risk of exploding and it was surgically removed by doctors. Octomom Nadia Sulman became notorious in 2009 when she had 8 babies as a result of in vitro fertilization. However, Nadia claimed that while she was heavily sedated, it was her fertility specialist that convinced her to have 12 embryos implanted in her at once. All of the babies miraculously survived, but the doctor had his license revoked for extreme malpractice. This violin was used by the lead member of the band that played on the Titanic. Just like in the movie, they continued playing as the ship went down. Former beauty queen Joyce McKinney made headlines in 1977 when she kidnapped 17-year-old Mormon boy Kirk Anderson from his church. According to Anderson, she chained him to her bed frame and forced him to be her sex slave for 3 straight days. But according to British law at the time, no crime of rape had been committed since the victim was male. There was a famous Jewish boxer named Salomo Aruch who was imprisoned at Auschwitz. He was forced to fight fellow prisoners and the loser was sent to the gas chambers. He survived more than 200 fights over a 2-year span until the camp was liberated. 80% of the males born in the Soviet Union in 1923 were killed during World War II. This is a group of teenage kamikaze pilots posing with a cute puppy on the day before their suicide missions in 1945. In 1951, an atomic bomb cameraman accidentally ripped off his safety goggles a few seconds before the bomb exploded. With no time to spare, he immediately covered his eyes with his hands, and when the bomb detonated, he saw the bones of his hands through his closed eyelids just like an X-ray. This iconic photograph of 28-year-old Marcy Borders covered in dust was taken just after the World Trade Center collapsed on 9/11. Marcy was a bank teller who worked on the 81st floor of the North Tower. She survived the collapse, but sadly died from cancer in 2014, likely caused by the toxic fumes she was exposed to. This is the gravestone of H.R. Giger, the Swiss artist and sculptor who designed the creatures for the movie Alien. On a British Airways flight in 1995, a woman was complaining of chest pain, so 2 doctors came over to check on her. They quickly realized she was suffering from a punctured lung and required immediate surgery. But the problem was they couldn't land for help since the increase in air pressure could kill her. So they performed mid-air surgery on her using a coat hanger, silverware, and a bottle of cognac for sterilization. Within 10 minutes, they'd saved her life. During the Holocaust, gay males were identified in concentration camps by downward-facing pink triangles. Because of this identification, many of them were still considered criminals after their camps were liberated. As a result, many of them were sent back to prison to serve out their terms. A Japanese soldier named Hiro Onada was stranded on an island for 30 years without knowing that World War II had ended. His commander had to travel to the island to personally dismiss him in 1974. American Lieutenant John Fox died after deliberately calling an artillery strike on himself. Realizing that German troops were overriding his position, the strike delayed the enemy long enough for other American units to organize a counterattack that ultimately won them the battle. Peter Freuchen was a 6'7" Danish explorer who was the real-life version of the most interesting man in the world. Throughout the 1910s, he rode thousands of miles across the Arctic by dog sled. On one occasion, he became trapped in an avalanche and was buried deep in a pile of snow and ice. Lacking any sharp weapon to escape, he created a dagger out of his frozen feces and broke through the ice with his bare hands. After crawling back to base camp for 3 hours, he noticed his toes had turned black, so he amputated them by himself with nothing but a pair of pliers. In the years that followed, he was the star of an Oscar-winning movie, wrote 32 books as an author, and became the 5th person to win the jackpot on the famous game show The $64,000 Question. In his later years, he became actively involved in the Dutch resistance and fought against Nazi occupation in Denmark. He was seen as such a threat to the Nazi movement that Hitler himself ordered him to be arrested and sentenced to death. The photo above shows Peter standing next to his 3rd wife, wearing a coat made out of the polar bear that was unlucky enough to cross his path. Peo the French Stallion is a 16-year-old therapy horse that provides comfort to patients suffering from terminal cancer. Each day, he chooses which patients he wants to visit by kicking his hoofs outside their doors. This blind pregnant woman got her ultrasound 3D printed and was overcome with joy. In 2005, a bald eagle was shot in the face by a poacher, causing her to lose her beak. She struggled to eat anything and was on the verge of starving until a non-profit organization gave her a 3D printed prosthetic beak, making her even more badass than ever before. In 2020, a woman from Vancouver had a teddy bear stolen from her which had a voice recording of her deceased mother who passed away from cancer. But after celebrities like Ryan Reynolds offered a cash reward and helped make the story go viral, the teddy bear was soon found and returned. Here's an incredible photo of one of the rarest wild animals in the United States, a wild jaguar captured on a trail cam in southern Arizona. Jaguars once roamed from California to Louisiana, but hunting and habitat loss over the years eliminated them from the U.S. by the mid-20th century. Now, after decades of absence, a small number of wild males have begun returning from Mexico, giving scientists hope the species may be reclaiming part of its historic range. There are still no known breeding females in the United States, so every trail cam photo is considered an extremely rare glimpse of America's largest native cat. This picture was accidentally left behind by a woman who helped build the first iPhones. In 2008, a Foxconn factory worker forgot to delete her camera's test photos before the phone was shipped off to a customer in Britain. After he posted them online, the smiling worker became an instant internet sensation known simply as iPhone Girl. Here's a photo of a nuclear explosion less than 1 millisecond after detonation. At this moment, the fireball was only about 66 feet across but already millions of degrees, roughly 3 times hotter than the surface of the sun. The spikes hanging beneath it are steel support cables being instantly vaporized into glowing plasma. The image was captured in 1952 using an ultra-high-speed camera, revealing the first moments of a nuclear explosion in a way the human eye never could. Once one of Britain's biggest television stars thanks to her role on EastEnders, Daniela Westbrook's life was completely derailed by a severe cocaine addiction. She later admitted to using staggering amounts of the drug at the peak of her addiction, spending around $400 daily and using up to 5 grams a day. Years of abuse destroyed much of her nasal septum, causing part of her nose to collapse and requiring numerous reconstructive surgeries. She's also survived uterine cancer, sepsis, facial fractures, and repeated relapses, with her appearance becoming one of the most striking examples of the effects of long-term cocaine abuse. Between 1974 and 1975, an unidentified serial killer known as the Doodler stalked gay nightclubs across San Francisco, where he sketched men before luring them to secluded areas and stabbing them to death. Investigators believe he murdered at least 5 men, while 3 other victims survived. Police reportedly identified a prime suspect, but the surviving victims refused to testify because they were afraid to publicly come out as gay, and the case remains unsolved more than 50 years later. This was the moment panic spread through a packed subway train after a man suddenly began spraying an unknown substance into the crowded carriage. As the mist spread through the enclosed train car, confused passengers started covering their faces and frantically trying to move away. Though some reports called it an irritant spray, many online viewers speculated that it may have instead been some kind of prank fart spray. The incident reportedly happened aboard a subway train in Guangzhou, China. The man involved was soon detained by authorities after the incident, though his motive remains unclear. This was the moment a German Shepherd found himself dangling off the edge of a high apartment balcony after laying too close to the edge and slipping underneath the metal railing. Trapped several stories above the ground, the terrified dog desperately tried to hold himself up using only his front paws as his back legs hung helplessly in the air. With nothing to grip onto to pull himself back up, the dog could do nothing but hang on for dear life. If he lost his grip, the fall could have easily killed him or left him severely injured. But suddenly, the exhausted dog noticed his owner becoming aware of the situation and immediately started wagging his tail. Luckily, the woman rushed over and pulled him to safety just moments before the dog became too tired to hang on. In November of 2023, 56-year-old Bart Ryder went in for a routine cataract surgery in Colorado and died because no one realized he stopped breathing. A lawsuit later revealed that the surgeon and anesthesiologist were playing a music bingo game during the procedure, and although Ryder was hooked up to monitors, the audible alarms weren't turned on. He soon turned blue under the sheet while staff focused on the playlist instead of his vitals. By the time they realized his oxygen had crashed about 11 minutes in, he'd already suffered fatal cardiac arrest. Both doctors admitted under oath that they were playing the game, and the case was settled outside of court. This photo was taken at 10:28 a.m. on 9/11 by photographer Bill Bigart, just seconds before the North Tower collapsed and killed him. Bigart had rushed toward the burning towers while most people were running away, documenting the chaos from the streets below. When crews later found his body in the rubble, they also recovered his cameras and memory cards, which held the final 150 photos of his life, including this one, time-stamped less than 10 seconds before the collapse buried him where he stood. A little after 1 a.m. inside their Texas City home, 15-year-old Jaden Gonzalez was handling a pistol when it suddenly went off, the bullet hitting his 17-year-old brother Joshua in the chest. Their father, 41-year-old Jay Gonzalez, was right there when the shot rang out and immediately dropped to the floor to help, desperately trying to stop the bleeding and keep Joshua conscious. But in the middle of the chaos, with his son dying right in front of him, Jay's body gave out. He collapsed from a medical emergency believed to be a heart attack. By the time paramedics arrived, Joshua was already gone and Jay couldn't be revived. Police confirmed the shooting was accidental, leaving the family with 2 tragic deaths within the span of minutes. This was the moment skydiving student Christopher Jones suddenly went unconscious during what was supposed to be a routine training skydive in 2014. At around 9,000 feet, his body stiffened and began violently seizing in freefall, his head snapping back as he lost all control, tumbling through the air with no ability to deploy his parachute. Realizing what was happening, instructor Sheldon McFarland chased him down mid-air, fighting the wind and closing the distance with mere seconds to spare. McFarland eventually managed to grab Jones, stabilize his limp body, and pull his ripcord just in time, preventing a horrific fall that would have instantly been fatal. If you're a bad person who's afraid of heights, here's a sneak peek of what hell looks like. During a sudden storm at Six Flags Mexico in August of 2024, riders on the Sky Screamer swing ride found themselves trapped nearly 250 feet in the air as heavy rain and strong winds moved in. Instead of descending, the ride's automatic safety systems activated and locked the chairs in place, leaving passengers suspended high above the park with their legs dangling as powerful storms intensified around them. For roughly 10 minutes, riders were forced to remain exposed to the storm storm with no control over the situation, unsure of what would happen next or if the ride would be struck by lightning. Eventually, the ride was safely lowered once conditions stabilized and no physical injuries were reported. This Russian woman experienced what may be a worst-case scenario while riding an elevator. Just moments after the doors closed, the elevator's power unit suddenly exploded, sending flames shooting from the control panel and filling the small cabin with thick smoke. Trapped inside with nowhere to go, she was suddenly confined inside a metal box filling with fire and toxic fumes. In enclosed spaces, smoke inhalation can become deadly long before the flames themselves, with a lack of oxygen and exposure to toxic gases causing people to lose consciousness within minutes. As the damage continued to spread, the woman could do nothing but wait and hope for the elevator to reach a floor. Fortunately, the doors eventually opened, allowing her to escape the nightmare. This diver came terrifyingly close to being swallowed by a whale. He was swimming among a dense school of fish when a massive mouth suddenly emerged from the darkness beside him. The whale narrowly missed pulling him completely into its mouth, instead just stealing one of his flippers as it surged past. But despite how terrifying it looked, the whale likely never intended to target him. Baleen whales are filter feeders that feed on fish and krill, and while their mouths are enormous, their throats are typically the size of a human fist, far too small to swallow an adult. Had he been engulfed, he likely would have been trapped inside the whale's mouth for a few terrifying moments before being spat back out as the whale filtered its catch. However, had he been dealing with a sperm whale, this would have been a much different story. In 2020, Megan the Stallion survived an attack that left her bleeding in the street, shot in both of her feet as she tried to walk away from a late-night argument. Bullet fragments tore into the back of her left heel and scattered through the soles of both feet. Injuries so deep that surgeons couldn't remove all the shrapnel, and pieces are still lodged inside her body. The man she identified as the shooter was later convicted and sentenced, but Megan has said the worst part wasn't the pain. It was being viciously mocked online by people who insisted she was lying, exaggerating, or milking the incident while she was recovering from gunshot wounds. In 1910 Los Angeles, a woman named Miss Bell had been searching for her missing Scotch Terrier for weeks when her friend G.E. Seawright stumbled upon the answer by pure nightmare coincidence. The man was having a hot dog for lunch when he suddenly bit down on something hard, a small metal object hidden deep inside his meal. When he fished it out and wiped it clean, he immediately froze. Stamped on the metal was the identification number of Miss Bell's missing dog. Only then did he realize the horrific truth. The dog had somehow been cooked into the meat of a local hot dog stand. This was the moment when a hang gliding instructor realized he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. In November of 2018 in Switzerland, American tourist Chris Gursky had just taken off on a tandem hang gliding flight when he and the instructor immediately noticed that Gursky was not attached to the safety harness at all. The instructor immediately attempted an emergency stop, but strong winds instead lifted the glider higher into the air, sending them soaring hundreds of feet above the ground. With no safety line and no way to land immediately, Gursky was left dangling with nothing securing him to the aircraft. He was forced to cling to the metal frame with his hands while also desperately gripping the instructor to avoid falling. For more than 2 minutes, Gursky held on for dear life as his arms visibly shook and his grip weakened, fully aware that giving in to the pain would mean certain death. The entire ordeal was captured on video as the instructor desperately fought the wind and steered toward an emergency landing. When they finally reached the ground, Gursky collapsed in pain and was later diagnosed with a fractured wrist and torn bicep from hanging on so tightly. Authorities ruled the accident a serious safety failure, fining the instructor and suspending his license, while the footage became a chilling reminder of how one small misstep turned a fun recreational flight into a life-threatening nightmare. In February of 2007, over New South Wales, Australia, Polish-German paraglider Eva Wisniewska was sucked into a massive thunderstorm during a routine training flight and carried to nearly 33,000 feet, where temperatures dropped to around negative 50 degrees Celsius and oxygen levels were extremely low. She lost consciousness for about 40 minutes as her paraglider was tossed around inside the storm, yet somehow remained airborne. When the storm weakened, she descended and regained consciousness mid-air, surviving with only frostbite and minor bruising. Another pilot caught in the storm, Hee Zong-pin, was found dead nearly 50 miles away. In 2007 in California, a 23-year-old man crashed into a police vehicle and, fearing arrest, swallowed an absurd amount of methamphetamine he'd been carrying. He fled on foot, was chased across rooftops, and was eventually captured in a highly agitated, delirious state. At the hospital, his core body temperature reached 45 degrees Celsius, the highest ever recorded in a surviving patient with lab-confirmed stimulant overdose. He immediately had to be sedated, intubated, and aggressively cooled with ice packs and fluids as his body began to shut down. Despite the extreme heat and severe toxicity, he miraculously survived after intensive treatment. Here's an insane video taken by a museum visitor showing the incredible detail in a painting from the 1600s. The artwork is cognoscenti in a room hung with pictures, painted around 1620 by Flemish artists Willem van Heekt and Jan Bruegel the Younger. Scenes like this were known as gallery painting, a genre that depicted wealthy collectors showing off rooms packed with artworks, sculptures, and curiosities. Many of the tiny paintings shown inside the scene are actually real masterpieces of the time, carefully recreated in miniature fashion. Here's a photo of mummified crocodiles in the Egyptian Museum, a practice that dates back more than 2,000 years in ancient Egypt. Crocodiles were associated with the crocodile-headed god Sobek, who was believed to control the power of the Nile and protect people from its dangers. In temples dedicated to Sobek, crocodiles were sometimes raised in sacred pools, adorned with jewelry, and treated as living embodiments of the god. When they died, priests carefully mummified them using linen wrappings and resins, just like they did to humans. Thousands of crocodile mummies have been discovered in Egypt, including entire burial caches filled with both adult crocodiles and hatchlings, which were likely offered as religious sacrifices to the god. This was the final note written by Marie Antoinette at 4:30 a.m. on October 16, 1793, just hours before she was executed in Paris, France during the French Revolution. Addressed to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, from her cell, the letter includes the lines, "My lord, have pity on me. My eyes have no more tears to cry for you, my poor children. Farewell, farewell." Later that morning, Marie Antoinette was taken through the streets of Paris and executed by guillotine at the age of 37. This extremely rare glass octopus was caught on camera during a deep-sea expedition near the remote Phoenix Islands, over 3,200 miles north of Sydney, Australia. Filmed by an underwater robot, the creature is almost entirely transparent, with only its eyes, optic nerves, and digestive system visible inside its fragile, gelatinous body. Living thousands of feet below the surface, glass octopuses are one of the ocean's most elusive species, being rarely ever seen by humans. Scientists believe this transparency helps it avoid predators in the pitch-black depths, making sightings like this one incredibly rare. This is what it looks like when an iceberg flips and reveals its underside. That deep blue that's emerging isn't from the ocean, but the iceberg itself. Over thousands of years, the snow was compressed so tightly it lost its air bubbles, so instead of scattering light, it absorbs most colors and reflects blue. When it flips, it exposes that dense, ancient ice, creating that otherworldly glow. This flower is called the Queen of the Night, and it only blooms for a few hours once a year. All year long, it looks like a plain cactus, but on that one night, it suddenly opens into a massive flower with a strong, sweet scent meant to attract nighttime pollinators. By sunrise, it's already wilting, making the entire bloom easy to miss unless you're there at exactly the right time. Here's a video of a cannon being fired to trigger an avalanche, a controlled safety procedure used in mountainous regions to reduce the risk of dangerous, unpredictable slides. By firing explosives or specialized avalanche cannons into unstable snowpack, crews can release smaller avalanches on their own terms before pressure builds into something large enough to threaten roads, ski resorts, or local communities. The goal isn't to create destruction, but to stabilize slopes by releasing weak layers of snow that could otherwise collapse later under the weight of new snowfall or passing skiers. Timing, weather data, and snowpack analysis all play a role in deciding when a controlled release is necessary. I don't know what to say. This girl was filming herself when she accidentally captured an unbelievable meteorite breaking apart in the skies above Portugal. This guy who lives in Alaska saw that video and said, "Hold my beer." The aurora borealis forms when charged particles from the sun interact with the Earth's magnetic field and gases in the upper atmosphere. Oxygen typically produces green or red light, while nitrogen can appear blue or purple. These reactions happen about 60 to 200 miles above the surface, which is why the lights look like they're moving across the entire night sky. Between 2016 and 2022 in Germany, reality TV star Theresia Fischer underwent 2 leg lengthening surgeries that increased her height by about 14 centimeters or 5.5 inches. The procedure required doctors to break her leg bones and implant adjustable metal rods, slowly extending them over time as new bone formed. Although the surgeries achieved the desired height, Fisher later said the process left her in constant pain during the recovery and emotionally scarred, revealing she felt pressured into it by a former partner and ultimately came to regret altering her body so drastically. Between 1975 and 1979, Cambodia was controlled by the Khmer Rouge regime, a brutal communist regime that targeted and executed educated people, including doctors, teachers, and anyone seen as intellectual. During this time, OB/GYN Dr. Hein S. Nagor was forced into labor camps and survived by hiding his medical background, knowing it would mean certain death if discovered. When his wife went into labor and required a life-saving C-section, Nagor faced an impossible choice: perform the procedure and expose himself, or stay silent and let his wife die. He chose not to risk it, and both his wife and their unborn child died during childbirth. Here's some insane footage of a domestic cat that's reached an astounding age of 29 years, the rough human equivalent of someone in their late 130s. Most house cats live 12 to 15 years, and even reaching 20 is rare. Cats that make it this far are often born with unusually resistant genetics that slow age-related organ failure, especially in the kidneys and heart, and that advantage is typically reinforced by consistent care in a low-stress environment. A doorbell cam caught this bird appearing to float in midair because the camera's frame rate synced perfectly with its wings. Each time the camera captured a frame, the bird's wings were in the exact same position, creating the illusion that it was suspended motionless above the driveway. In January of 2020, Storm Gloria completely battered the coast of Spain, whipping seawater rich in organic material into massive clouds of sea foam. Powerful winds blew the foam inland, piling it waist-high through the streets and swallowing storefronts, cars, and people. The surreal scenes were a side effect of a storm that also caused deadly flooding, widespread destruction, and multiple fatalities across the country. This video has been causing panic across the internet after two rare doomsday fish washed ashore on a beach in Cabo, Mexico. Creatures are called oarfish, long ribbon-like deep-sea animals that normally live thousands of feet below the surface and are almost never seen by humans. According to Japanese folklore, oarfish are known as messengers from the sea god's palace and are said to appear before major disasters. In reality, when oarfish are seen near the surface or close to the shore, it often means they're sick, injured, or dying, which is one of the reasons why sightings are so rare. But because of the old folklore surrounding them and recent current events, the appearance of two at the same beach quickly sparked alarm online. Scientists in Melbourne, Australia recently did something incredible by connecting about 200,000 living human brain cells grown in a lab dish to a computer and using them to play the 1993 video game Doom. Neurons, grown from human stem cells and placed on a microchip with electrodes, received electrical signals representing what was happening in the game. When the cells fired in certain patterns, the system translated that activity into in-game actions like moving or shooting enemies. Researchers said the neurons showed signs of learning through feedback, though they currently perform poorly and often die during experiments. The project, developed by Cortical Labs as part of its biological computer, is an attempt to combine living human brain tissue with silicone hardware. In 1995, in Knoxville, Tennessee, 18-year-old Krista Pike lured 19-year-old Colleen Slemmer to a secluded area on a Job Corps campus where she spent 30 to 40 minutes torturing her. Slemmer was beaten, slashed repeatedly, and had a pentagram carved into her chest while she screamed and begged for her life, before Pike ultimately crushed her skull with a chunk of asphalt. Afterward, Pike removed a piece of Slemmer's skull and kept it as a souvenir. Pike was later sentenced to death and remains the only woman on Tennessee's death row. Decades later, Slemmer's mother is still fighting to have the skull fragment returned for a proper burial, but Tennessee officials continue to hold it as evidence due to Pike's ongoing appeals and active death row status. Extra Morbid Facts, Part 154. In July of 2012, 16-year-old Skylar Neese climbed out of her bedroom window after midnight to meet her two closest friends, 16-year-old Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf, believing they were going for a fun late-night drive. But instead, they crossed into a secluded wooded area in Pennsylvania, put on hoodies and gloves they had brought with them, counted to 3, and stabbed her more than 50 times in what prosecutors described as a premeditated attack. Investigators later revealed the motive was disturbingly simple. Schoaf said they didn't like her anymore and didn't want to be friends. For months after her disappearance, both girls publicly mourned her on social media, posting heartfelt tributes while knowing exactly where her body was. The case unraveled when Schoaf finally confessed and led authorities to Skylar's remains. She was sentenced to 30 years to life and was eligible for parole in 2023, but remains incarcerated after being denied release. Sheila Eddy received a life sentence and becomes eligible for parole in 2028. In 2022, DMV rapper Markel Moro, aka Gunu, was shot and killed in Washington, D.C. Days later, his family held a memorial inside a D.C. nightclub where his embalmed body was dressed in designer clothes, propped upright on stage and displayed while his music played to a crowd. The invite-only event was attended by family, friends, and fans, turning a nightclub into a viewing space and leaving people standing feet away from his real corpse. There's no evidence Gunu ever requested this, making it one of the strangest memorials ever held for a deceased rapper. A baby named Breland was born completely healthy, but just 2 days after birth, she was kissed on the mouth by someone with an active cold sore. Because her immune system was not yet developed, she contracted herpes simplex virus, which spread to her brain and caused HSV encephalitis. The infection led to seizures and permanent brain damage, another case demonstrating why you should be very careful when kissing a baby. In 1925, Ora Ralph Thomas, an Illinois sheriff's deputy during the Prohibition era, was assassinated by members of the KKK. Thomas was the leader of an armed anti-Klan paramilitary group, making him a direct target. When 3 Klansmen ambushed him, Thomas returned fire, shooting and killing all 3 of his attackers before succumbing to his own wounds. Scientists have captured the oldest living vertebrate on Earth drifting through near black Arctic waters, a Greenland shark moving slowly through the depths. Clear footage of these sharks is extremely uncommon because they live so deep and in low light. Scientists believe some can live for centuries, with eye lens analysis suggesting lifespans up to 400 years and possibly even closer to 500. They only grow about a centimeter per year, yet can still reach lengths over 20 feet, and females may not reach sexual maturity until around 150 years old, one of the slowest life cycles ever recorded. Many carry parasites that eventually damage their vision, yet they still hunt using scent and vibration. If the highest estimates are correct, this animal could have been alive since the 1500s, moving through the ocean long before the Pilgrims sailed to America. Here's some footage from an actual other world, captured by a robotic rover crawling across the surface of Mars, nearly 225 million miles from Earth. What you're seeing isn't a traditional video recording. It's a splicing of thousands of individual photos stitched together into a moving panorama, since rovers don't record footage the way cameras on Earth do. Every frame has to survive extreme cold, radiation, and dust before being sent back as radio signals traveling through space. You're looking at terrain no human has ever touched, ancient rock formations and dry landscapes that may have once held water, captured piece by a machine made by humans exploring a silent planet. In honor of Part 9/11, here are the most morbid facts I've ever posted about 9/11. In 1983, professional climber Dan Goodwin illegally climbed the North Tower of the World Trade Center. He said he was trying to bring attention to the inability to rescue trapped occupants of the upper levels of skyscrapers. In August of 2001, actor James Woods reported 4 suspicious men on his flight, but authorities didn't take his claims seriously. Turns out there were 4 of the hijackers who would go on to crash into the World Trade Center, and this was one of their test runs. Afghan resistance leader Ahmad Shamu Sood warned about a major terrorist attack that was about to happen on U.S. soil, but he ended up being assassinated just 2 days before 9/11. An FBI counterterrorism expert John O'Neill urged the federal government to take the threat of Al-Qaeda more seriously, but he was eventually pushed into early retirement due to disagreements with the Bureau. He went on to head security at the World Trade Center, where he was killed on 9/11. Seth MacFarlane and Mark Wahlberg were both booked to fly on American Airlines Flight 11, the first plane that crashed into the World Trade Center. But Wahlberg decided last minute to fly to Toronto instead, while MacFarlane missed the flight by 10 minutes due to a hangover. Released in June of 2000, video game Deus Ex didn't include the World Trade Center in its skyline due to technical limitations. The in-game explanation was that they were destroyed in a terrorist attack. In August of 2000, the band Dream Theater recorded a live studio album called Live Scenes from New York. The album cover art features the New York City skyline with the Twin Towers on fire. Most disturbingly, the album was quickly pulled from shelves after coincidentally being released on September 11, 2001. Only one non-military plane was allowed to fly after all commercial flights were forced to land. It was delivering anti-venom to a snake handler in Florida who was bitten by the highly venomous taipan snake. Sculptor Michael Richards was killed in his art studio on the 92nd floor of the North Tower on 9/11. His art ironically focused on planes, including a sculpture of airplanes piercing a cast of his own body. This iconic photograph of 28-year-old Marcy Borders covered in dust was taken just after the World Trade Center collapsed. Marcy was a bank teller who worked on the 81st floor of the North Tower. She survived the collapse but sadly died from cancer in 2014, likely caused by the toxic fumes she was exposed to. The only off-duty NYPD officer who was killed in 9/11 had signed his retirement papers that morning, but instead of leaving his badge, John William Perry decided to pick it up one last time. Here's a photo of Pork Chop the search dog receiving fluids and comfort before returning to his duties. Many 9/11 rescue dogs were becoming depressed because they weren't finding any live bodies. Rescue workers had to constantly bury themselves to trick the dogs into thinking they were actually saving someone. Tanya Head was a well-known 9/11 survivor who faked being in the South Tower during the attacks. She served as president of the World Trade Center Survivors Network for years until it was revealed she wasn't even in the country on 9/11. Known as the Meteor, this was the result of 5 floors of the World Trade Center being compressed together after the towers collapsed. It's not known if there are any human remains inside. Long after the cleanup, body parts were still being recovered. In 2006, the arm of a victim was found on the roof of a nearby bank. And as recently as 2013, fragments of human remains were discovered on top of a Manhattan rooftop more than a decade after the attacks. In 2002, a 15-year-old boy became inspired by the terrorist attacks on 9/11. He decided to steal an airplane and fly it into a building in Tampa, Florida. It ended up only damaging one office room, and he was the only person that died. Since 9/11, more than 40,000 people have been diagnosed with cancers and chronic illnesses linked to the toxic dust released when the towers collapsed, a debris cloud made up of pulverized concrete, asbestos, fuel, and materials from office equipment and lighting systems. More first responders have died from 9/11 related illnesses than on the actual day of 9/11. Even nearly 25 years after the attacks, victims of 9/11 are still being identified. In 2025, 3 more people were named through advanced DNA testing using tiny fragments recovered from the World Trade Center site. But of the 2,977 victims, 1,100 of them still have no identified remains. Here's an extremely rare encounter with the Tibetan fox, an animal most people don't even know exists. The Tibetan fox is one of the least documented wild candids in the world, native to the high-altitude Tibetan Plateau, where it survives above 12,000 feet in extreme cold and isolation. The fox is instantly recognizable by its unusually square-shaped head, narrow eyes, and thick fur, giving it the appearance of a fox you drew in 3rd grade art class. Solitary and highly specialized, it relies heavily on plateau pikas for food, tying its survival to a very narrow ecosystem, which makes genuine close-up encounters in the wild highly uncommon. Here's some incredible footage of the oldest person ever captured on film. This is Pope Leo XIII, born in 1810, appearing in an 1898 motion picture at the age of 88. By the time this was filmed, Leo XIII had already been alive for nearly 9 decades. He was born when many people who had fought in the American Revolution were still alive, lived through the reigns of multiple emperors and kings, was already an elderly man during Abraham Lincoln's presidency, and is even older than your mom. In 2015, 25-year-old Mina El Houari traveled all the way from France to Fez, Morocco, to meet an online boyfriend she'd been speaking to for months, booking herself into a luxury hotel before their first date. When they got together in the evening, Mina suddenly collapsed, slipping into what was later determined to be an undiagnosed diabetic coma. But instead of calling for medical help, the man panicked and assumed she was dead. He drove her to his home, dug a shallow grave in his backyard, and buried her alive while she was still breathing. Mina slowly suffocated underground, never regaining consciousness. When her family lost contact with her, they filed a missing persons report and flew to Morocco to search. Police questioning led them to the man's home, where muddy clothing and a shovel exposed the crime scene. He later confessed and was charged with involuntary manslaughter, turning a young woman's hopeful search for love into a real-life nightmare. In Flint, Michigan in 1978, 14-month-old Keith Edmonds was crying in his crib when his mother's boyfriend lost control and forced the baby's face against a red-hot electric heater. The metal burned so deeply that half of Keith's face suffered 3rd-degree burns. Doctors said the damage destroyed one eye, severely injured the other, and left his face permanently disfigured. He underwent years of surgeries, skin grafts, and hospital treatment just to survive. The attacker was convicted of severe child abuse and sentenced to 10 years in prison, while Keith spent most of his childhood in hospitals and foster care before eventually reuniting with his mother. Haunted by the trauma, he later struggled with addiction into adulthood but managed to turn his life around at age 35. In 2016, he founded the Keith Edmonds Foundation, which now helps abused and neglected children through various programs. In Tewkesbury, England, 56-year-old Amanda Nixon, a mother of 10, was found guilty of essentially holding a female slave captive in her home for 25 years, exploiting her as a forced domestic servant under harrowing conditions. Wixon brought the victim into her household in the mid-1990s when she was a teenager with learning difficulties, and over the next quarter-century kept her locked inside, regularly physically abusing her, strangling her, hitting her with a broom handle hard enough to knock her teeth out, squirting detergent down her throat, splashing bleach on her face, and forcibly shaving her head. Prosecutors told the court that Wixon deprived her of food, basic hygiene, medical and dental care, and any freedom to leave, even collecting state benefits paid on the victim's behalf while the victim lived in squalor. Wixon denied all the charges, blamed her son for the situation, and showed no remorse, dismissing the convictions as rubbish and refusing to express regret, as jurors convicted her of false imprisonment, forced labor, and assault after hearing evidence of the decades of cruelty. This photo shows 15-year-old Preston Porter Jr. reading a Bible as he's led by rope toward his own execution by a lynch mob in Colorado in 1900. He'd been held and tortured for 4 days, beaten until he finally confessed to killing a white girl after police told him his father and brother would also be lynched if he didn't comply. Still a child, Preston was denied a trial and handed over to a crowd that had already decided his fate. He was tied to a stake and burned alive in public as excited spectators watched. Despite the coerced confession, his age, and the brutality involved, Preston was never posthumously exonerated. No official apology was issued, no conviction was overturned, and no one was held accountable. In 2012, Harold Henthorne claimed that his wife Toni had died in a hiking accident after falling 140 feet off a cliff in Rocky Mountain National Park. On the day of their 12th wedding anniversary, Harold insisted on a strenuous hike up Deer Mountain despite Toni's bad knee and limited hiking experience. After her fall, he gave investigators multiple conflicting accounts, repeatedly changing what he said he was doing at the moment she fell over the edge. Investigators later found a map in his car with the exact location of her death marked with an X, and uncovered that his spouse before Toni had also died years earlier under mysterious circumstances. Toni's death closely resembled the 1995 death of Lynn Henthorne, who was crushed beneath a Jeep on a remote Colorado road when it supposedly slipped off a jack. Harold claimed both deaths were merely accidents, but prosecutors argued the similarities were far too extreme to be considered coincidence. In 2015, he was convicted of murdering Toni Henthorne and sentenced to life in prison. Here's a photo of Magda Goebbels with her 6 children, taken sometime before all 6 would be murdered by their own parents as Nazi Germany collapsed. Their father, Joseph Goebbels, wasn't just a high-ranking Nazi, but the architect of the regime's propaganda machine, a man responsible for saturating Germany with anti-Semitic hatred, glorifying mass murder, justifying the Holocaust, and convincing millions that extermination and total war were moral duties. He publicly called for the annihilation of Jews, celebrated civilian deaths, and demanded Germans to fight to extinction rather than surrender, even as cities burned and children starved. As Soviet forces closed in on Berlin in May of 1945, Goebbels remained fanatically loyal to Hitler, retreating with his family into the Führer bunker. There, Magda decided that her children could not live in a world without Nazism, poisoning each of them with cyanide as they slept. Afterward, Joseph and Magda reportedly took their own lives as Berlin fell and the Third Reich collapsed around them. In 2012, a homeless man named Ronald Papo was savagely attacked beneath a Miami overpass in an assault caught on camera lasting 18 minutes. The attacker, Rudy Eugene, beat him unconscious and chewed away most of his face, including an eyeball, leaving Papo permanently disfigured and blind. Police arrived during the attack and fatally shot Eugene when he ignored commands and continued biting his victim. Papo survived after extensive surgeries but was left permanently disfigured. Despite early claims of drug-induced madness, toxicology reports failed to identify any substance that could fully explain the horrific attack. Jack Black's teenage years were marked by addiction long before fame entered his life. After his parents divorced, he began stealing money from his mom to buy cocaine at just 14 years old, spiraling into substance abuse while still practically a child. The addiction took hold during a period of instability and isolation, but he later thanked a non-judgmental school therapist with helping to pull him back from it. Jack ultimately got sober as a teenager, avoided relapsing as his career took off, and has spoken openly about how early intervention likely saved his life. In 1986, a Yakuza member attempting to smuggle a live hand grenade onto a flight from Manila to Osaka nearly took down the whole plane by accident. While hiding in the airport bathroom, the grenade's safety pin came loose, and in a moment of panic, the man abandoned it and fled back to his seat. Seconds later, the grenade exploded inside the aircraft, blasting a hole in the fuselage and resulting in rapid decompression. The explosion injured 109 passengers, but the plane somehow remained airborne long enough to make an emergency landing, narrowly avoiding what could have been one of the deadliest aviation attacks of the decade. Investigators later revealed that the man wasn't immediately arrested because he'd been badly injured in the blast. When the explosion ruptured a hydraulic line, hot oil sprayed all over his body, leaving him with severe burns that required immediate hospitalization before he was taken into custody. Susan King spent 6.5 years in prison for a murder she couldn't possibly have committed. She had one leg, weighed under 100 pounds, and didn't even own a car. Yet police claimed she beat, shot, and dragged a man before tossing his body off a bridge 40 miles away. The lead detective built the entire case on lies, fake ballistics, drag marks that were actually water damage, and blood evidence that never matched the victim. And investigators later admitted they had doubts about her guilt before it even went to trial. But terrified of facing life in prison or the death penalty, Susan took a plea deal and went to prison for murdering a man she never even laid her hands on. Years later, a different man confessed in detail to the murder, even describing facts never released to the public, and even claimed the same detective threatened him to stay quiet. Only then was Susan exonerated, and the state eventually paid her $750,000. The detective who framed her never faced charges. He simply retired while under investigation for unrelated sexual misconduct. On July 5, 2011, 37-year-old Kelly Thomas, a homeless man with schizophrenia, was beaten, pinned down, and repeatedly tased by Fullerton police during a violent encounter captured on audio and surveillance footage. Officers had responded to a call about someone allegedly breaking into cars, and when they found Thomas rummaging through trash near a bus depot, they claimed he became uncooperative during questioning, a claim later disputed by witnesses and contradicted by portions of the footage. As officers piled on top of him, Thomas screamed for his father, begged them to stop, and cried out that he was being killed. Prosecutors later noted he said, "Dad, help me," 31 times, "Help me, God," 26 times, and "Okay" or "I'm sorry" over and over as he slipped into unconsciousness. He arrived at the hospital in a coma with severe head trauma, multiple broken bones in his face, irreversible brain swelling, and died 5 days later. 2 officers were charged, including one for second-degree murder, but both of them walked free after the case collapsed in court. This was the moment when a pool cleaner spotted everyone's worst nightmare at the bottom of a backyard pool: the family dog completely motionless. The dog likely snuck into the pool area when the man opened the gate and fell in without anyone noticing. Luckily, the cleaner didn't hesitate, jumping straight into the water and dragging the lifeless dog to the surface before immediately starting chest compressions on the patio. After nearly a minute of desperate attempts to revive the dog, he suddenly gasped, coughed up water, and came back to life. A clutch rescue that hopefully earned the pool cleaner a decent tip. This woman is lucky to be alive after a cassowary casually walked up to her on a quiet beach, a bird often called the world's most dangerous for a reason. Native to parts of Oceania, cassowaries have dagger-like claws that can easily disembowel you with a single kick, and they've been responsible for multiple serious injuries and even fatal attacks when people panic or get too close. But this woman did the right thing by staying calm, since cassowaries are most aggressive when they feel threatened or startled. By remaining still and non-threatening, she kept the encounter from escalating into the type of attack the species is infamous for. This is one of the rarest sights a hiker can ever witness, the broken specter, where your shadow doesn't fall on the ground but appears to float like a giant ghost in the clouds behind you. When the sun hits a bank of mist at the perfect angle, your silhouette gets projected onto the fog and wrapped in a circular rainbow called a glory, creating the illusion of a towering figure surrounded by a halo. For centuries, mountaineers thought this was a supernatural omen since conditions have to line up perfectly for it to happen. Dense fog in front of you, clear sun behind you, and just seconds before the mist shifts and the whole apparition vanishes. Here's one of the rarest friendships ever recorded on camera. A Siberian tiger calmly strolling alongside a goat that was literally thrown inside its enclosure to be eaten. Everyone expected a routine kill like usual, but instead the tiger backed off, the goat stood his ground, and the two formed a bond no one could explain. They wandered the enclosure together like companions, stunning zookeepers as a predator and its intended meal lived in total harmony. After their unlikely bond went viral, the zoo kept them together under close supervision, naming them Timur and Amr. They stayed inseparable for months, sleeping near each other, exploring the enclosure, and even play fighting. But soon enough, instincts kicked in and the two became aggressive toward each other, ending one of the strangest animal friendships ever recorded. Jeff Garcia, best known for being the voice of Sheen in Jimmy Neutron, died on December 10th, 2025 at age 50 after a terrible chain of medical emergencies that began months earlier. He first suffered a brain aneurysm that caused him to collapse and hit his head, then later endured a stroke that left his health severely weakened. After a bout of pneumonia and repeated hospital visits for trouble breathing, Jeff's condition crashed when one of his lungs suddenly collapsed, forcing doctors to place him on life support. His family ultimately made the decision to pull the plug, ending a rapid decline that left fans stunned. That same day, veteran voice actor Jim Ward, who played Doug Dimmadome, owner of the Dimsdale Dimmadome, and dozens of other roles, died at 66 after years of complications with advanced Alzheimer's disease. Ward had already retired from voice work several years earlier as the disease progressed, losing his ability to continue performing before eventually requiring long-term care. According to his wife, the disease steadily deteriorated his health until his death on December 11, 2025. Together, their deaths marked the losses of two of the most iconic voices of Nickelodeon cartoons. 7-year-old Tasha Lee Lanham weighed just 12 pounds when she died in Pennsylvania in 1998, a skeletal, severely malnourished child whose body was closer in size and fragility to an infant than a second grader. Investigators determined she hadn't eaten for days, but the autopsy showed the damage was long-term. Almost zero body fat anywhere on her body, growth stunted to the size of a toddler, and teeth completely ground down in patterns medical examiners associate with prolonged starvation. Court records revealed that her mother, Michelle Tharp, had spent years isolating Tasha, deliberately withholding and rationing her food as punishment, and refusing medical care because any doctor would have immediately recognized the abuse. By the end, Tasha was so weak that missing just one more meal was enough to kill her. The medical examiner ruled her death a homicide caused by starvation and described the abuse as equivalent to prolonged torture. Michelle was later sentenced to death for starving her own daughter until her body finally gave out. Millie Bobby Brown grew up with a hidden disability most fans never knew about. She was born with partial hearing loss in one ear, which eventually progressed into full deafness on that side, forcing her to learn how to act without relying on sound cues. But while she was quietly dealing with that, she was also facing something much darker. By the time she was 14, adults on the internet were circulating sexualized memes, fake stories, and even deepfake style edits of her. Harassment so disturbing that her family briefly pulled her off social media to protect her from the abuse. David Harbour has been brutally open about the darkest years of his life, marked by untreated bipolar disorder, alcoholism, and suicidal thoughts. At 25, he was hospitalized after a manic episode so severe, he believed he was receiving divine messages and might be the Antichrist. Before that, he'd spent years drinking heavily and spiraling through periods of violent depression. Harbour says he came frighteningly close to suicide before finally seeking treatment. He credits acting with giving him a way to channel the chaos, and now sober and in treatment, he says he enjoys consciousness way too much to ever go back. During World War II, Nazi SS units carried out one of the regime's most disturbing programs, the mass kidnapping of up to 200,000 Polish children for forced Germanization. After being taken from their families, the children were sent to SS-run children's education camps, where they were subjected to horrific racial selection exams. SS doctors measured their skulls, noses, eye colors, and body proportions, trying to determine whether each child looked Aryan enough to be turned into a German. If a child passed the test, they were renamed, stripped of their identity, and adopted into German families as if they'd never been Polish at all. But if they failed, their fate was much darker. Many were transported to concentration camps, where countless children died from starvation, disease, abuse, or execution. Only an estimated 10 to 15% of the kidnapped children were ever found and returned to Poland after the war. At the Nuremberg trials, the Allies confirmed the program a form of genocide, the deliberate attempt to erase an entire population by stealing and remaking their children. Grace Van Dien, aka Chrissy, revealed that she was groomed by a producer while working on another project, an experience she said left her traumatized enough to step away from acting entirely. She described it as one of the darkest times of her life, saying Hollywood had become unsafe for her and that the incident permanently changed how she views the industry. Before Stranger Things, Brett Gelman endured years of darkness, losing his younger brother in a sudden tragedy, spiraling through severe depression, and battling suicidal thoughts while he struggled to afford rent and avoid homelessness. He says he was quietly blacklisted in Hollywood for speaking out against abusive workplaces, leaving him convinced his career would be over before it ever started. Mark Steger, the performer inside the Demogorgon suit, has said the role was one of the most physically dangerous of his career. The practical suit trapped extreme heat, restricted movement, and weighed so much that he repeatedly suffered heat exhaustion, ligament strain, and even collapsed during takes. At one point, he collapsed so fast the crew thought he'd gone into cardiac arrest. Steger said the Demogorgon required total body endurance just to survive filming wedding days. In 1966, 17-year-old Franca Viola became the center of one of Italy's most disturbing criminal traditions, the matrimonio reparatore, a so-called rehabilitating marriage, where a rapist could escape prosecution by marrying his victim. Franca was kidnapped by Filippo Melodia and held captive for 8 days, during which she was repeatedly assaulted as Melodia and his accomplices tried to force her into the marriage that would legally erase his crimes. But Franca did something that no woman in Italy had ever done before. She said no. Her refusal didn't just defy her attacker, it defied the entire legal system, the cultural norms of her town, and the centuries-old belief that a woman's honor could be restored by marrying the man who raped her. When Franca and her family pressed charges instead, the community turned on them. Their property was burned, they were publicly shamed, and they lived under constant threats for refusing to participate in the ritual that protected rapists. Melodia was eventually convicted of kidnapping, rape, and intimidation, but the law that allowed rapists to walk free by marrying their victims remained in place for another 15 years. Article 544, the clause that effectively turned sexual assault into a negotiable family arrangement, was finally repealed in 1981. This was the shocking moment her family realized they'd made a horrific mistake. In Thailand, a 65-year-old woman who was presumed dead stunned mourners when she suddenly started knocking from inside her coffin just moments before cremation. Her family had believed she'd passed away after appearing to stop breathing 2 days earlier, so she was transported hundreds of miles to a Bangkok area temple for her funeral. But just as monks were preparing the cremation rites, staff heard faint thuds coming from the coffin and opened it to find her alive, barely moving, eyes fluttering, and severely weakened from critically low blood sugar. Temple workers later said the knocking was so faint they almost dismissed it as part of the ritual drum sounds, meaning she was seconds away from being burned alive without anyone noticing. The discovery sparked outrage over how she was declared dead without a medical exam, and how close she came to cremation after laying unconscious in a sealed coffin for 2 days. She was rushed to the hospital and is now in stable condition, recovering under medical supervision after narrowly surviving her own funeral. An elementary school outing in British Columbia turned into absolute chaos on November 20th, 2025, when a grizzly bear suddenly charged a group of 4th and 5th graders from a wall to school as they paused on a riverside trail. 11 people were injured during the attack, including 2 children who were rushed to the hospital in critical condition, while 7 others were treated at the scene. Teachers fought the bear off with bear spray and a bear banger, likely preventing multiple deaths. The bear soon escaped back into the forest and has still not been found, and officials say they don't know what triggered the attack or whether the animal will strike again. What's especially unsettling is that the attack happened to a group large enough that grizzlies normally avoid entirely, suggesting something was deeply wrong with the monstrous animal. And until conservation officers track it down, the entire valley remains on edge, knowing an injured and unpredictable grizzly bear is still lurking somewhere in the shadows. These men were just arrested for planning something absolutely horrific. Gavin Weisenberg and Tanner Thomas of North Texas were arrested after federal investigators uncovered their deranged plan to sail to a Haitian island, massacre every man living there, and turn the women and children into sex slaves. Court documents say they weren't just fantasizing. They were buying a sailboat, gathering weapons, recruiting homeless people as soldiers, and even running crude training drills in rural Texas where they practiced ambushes and mock executions. Prosecutors say they mapped out the island on Google Earth, drafted a post-conquest government, and talked openly about executing the men, breeding the women, and raising enslaved children, all while one of them was coercing a minor into creating explicit material. The FBI foiled the plot before they could leave Texas, but the indictment describes a plan so violent and delusional, it reads like a real-life blueprint for a modern-day genocide. They now face up to life in federal prison if convicted of the conspiracy charge, and up to 30 years for the charges relating to CP.